Consecration. 1 year later. A year ago, Pope Francis consecrated Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Needless to say, the event triggered mixed emotions amongst Catholics of all stripes and was particularly contentious amongst traditionalists. Leaving aside traditionalists for a moment, it was interesting to see the reaction from the Novus Ordo crowd about the consecration. For many liberals and neocons, Ukraine became the new COVID, which is to say, it became the new current thing that inspired everyone's social media avatars and bumper stickers. That alone made the event something of an international sensation. The Novus Ordo world has convinced itself that John Paul II already performed the consecration of Russia the way that Our Lady requested at Fatima. While I am not as dogmatic about the minutiae as some traditionalists, I will never understand how it can be argued that John Paul II performed the consecration sufficiently, considering he never said Russia while doing so. Nonetheless, the Novus Ordo world was in a unique situation, as it had to somehow juggle its undying support for Ukraine while also reconciling with the fact that the bishops of Ukraine asked Pope Francis to finally perform the consecration of Russia the way the Virgin Mary requested. This request on behalf of the Ukrainian bishops was nothing if not an expression of the belief that John Paul II had not done the consecration properly. It really was something of an existential crisis for the JP2 consecration crowd, as they were left with a major conundrum. If John Paul II already did this, then why are the Ukrainian bishops asking for it again? If John Paul II already did it properly, then why didn't it work? If John Paul II didn't do it properly, then that would mean those crazy trads had been correct for the last 40 years. Yeesh. I recall reading an article from a major John Paul II defender who has defended the Polish Pope's consecration a number of times, wherein the author tried his best to prove that it had already been done, but ultimately, only heaven knows if it was valid. One commentator said on a broadcast that there was nothing wrong with John Paul II's consecration, but that maybe the effects had worn off and a new one was needed. I guess consecrations wear off in the Novus Ordo. But on the other hand, Pope Francis was going to do what the Ukrainian bishops asked, as if John Paul II hadn't done the job. What was a hyper-papalist to do? As confusing as things were in the Novus Ordo, things were equally as confusing in the traditionalist world. Now, what I'm going to say will likely offend some traditionalists, which is nothing new if you're familiar with my work, but I believe it must be said. There is a tendency in the traditionalist world to treat the Fatima consecration of Russia in a borderline superstitious way, as if a consecration is a talisman or lucky charm. Before you start throwing tomatoes at your screen, please let me explain what I mean. I worked for the Fatima Center and have digested a metric ton of Fatima literature in both my personal and professional life. As a result, I am convinced that John Paul II's consecration was not up to par. But I am also convinced that many so-called Fatimists, I don't mean this as a derogatory term, take somewhat of a legalist view about what would make a consecration valid. Aside from sacraments, where a consecration takes place, like the sacrament of Holy Communion, where the Eucharist is consecrated, a sacramental consecration, like that of Russia to the Immaculate Heart, does not come with strict rubrics or stipulations of matter and form that render something valid or invalid. In the case of a sacramental consecration, it is ultimately the intention that makes or breaks the act, and quite frankly, the prayers can be said in a number of ways. For example, a mother and father may consecrate their child to the Virgin Mary after the child is baptized, and they may do so by simply making their intentions known and by singing the Salve Regina. Or they may read a very specific prayer that has customarily been used for such an occasion. Now, a more specific prayer is arguably preferable, not for reasons of validity, but because greater specificity makes the intention more explicit, which in turn makes a more specific act of faith possible. Now, if a family were to consecrate a child at baptism, what evidence would the parents need to believe that the consecration was valid? Would the child have to be holy from birth, become a priest, never commit a sin? Ultimately, as we have said, the consecration is an act of faith, and only time will tell how things will play out. Also, even if the child was consecrated, it is not the case that the child loses his free will, which means he could reject any graces thrown his way. With the Fatima consecration of Russia, we do have some specifics, but not a whole lot. Ultimately, Our Lady requested the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in union with the bishops of the world. She said that it would be done too late, but promised the consecration would bring about the conversion of Russia and that in the end her Immaculate Heart would triumph. She did not give us rubrics to follow or explain how a given ceremony should take place. Yes, there is a ton of literature taking into account the words of Sister Lucy and even other mystics and visionaries about the consecration of Russia. But as far as what has been directly recorded as the words of Our Lady, we don't have that much. For the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart to be valid, it is simply necessary for the Pope of the Catholic Church to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart in union with the bishops. It would seem to me that if the Pope of the Catholic Church invites all the bishops of the world to take part in something, and then does something as the head of the bishops for the world to see, that this would constitute an act of the Pope in union with the bishops. This is what Pope Francis did. Ultimately, a consecration, any consecration, as we said, is an act of faith and not a magic trick. What I mean to say is that a consecration is ultimately a prayerful act of entrustment under the patronage of Christ, Mary, etc. Even if the consecration was valid, it would be erroneous to expect immediate results, or to even expect results in the way that you have defined what the results would look like. Did Our Lady say Russia would convert immediately? What would the conversion of Russia look like? Perhaps it would mean that the whole country had a major Catholic conversion and virtually everyone became a rosary-praying Catholic. Or maybe it just means that the Russian Orthodox Church comes into communion with Rome. Who knows? How and when the promises attached to the Fatima consecration will manifest themselves is a complete mystery, which is something we should be willing to accept. If we look to the scriptures, we find that the patriarchs were consecrated to God and were promised magnificent things, but they virtually never got to see the results. It is because men like Abraham and Moses acted on faith and did not expect to see results, which they didn't see, that we venerate them as the just men of the Old Covenant. In fact, when they don't wait patiently for the results, they're actually punished by God for their sinfulness. If we keep expecting or demanding a consecration of Russia that is quote-unquote just right or perfectly in line with non-binding interpretations of private revelations, then we won't be any different than the Israelites asking Moses to strike the rock over and over. So to keep the lights on here at the Kennedy Report, we have actually begun selling a couple different products. Right now we have sacred frankincense oil. You can see that right there. Boom. You can find this on the store. And I'm going to show you a camera trick here. You see I'm out of focus. White thing, come back in focus. I don't know why that works, but it does. In any case, this frankincense oil, you can find this in the link in the description of this video. Here's what is said about it. So it comes from the region of Oman, and getting this stuff into Canada, it was like trying to get nuclear plutonium. We had to get this one container of, I think it was a couple liters of pure frankincense oil, and it took months. Had to go through customs and all these sorts of things. I don't know why it was so difficult, but it's from this very exclusive region in the world. The story goes that this is the same region wherein the wise men would have got the oil that they brought Christ. Now, this is not a dogma of the faith. I'm not saying you have to believe it, but the reason they say that is because in the region where the wise men would have come from the east, this is a continually operative frankincense fabrication or production location that's been going on since before the time of Christ, and kings and noblemen used to get their stuff there. It's the best stuff in the world. You've maybe bought essential oils before, and if you have, you've probably bought them from companies that are run like sort of pseudo-pyramid schemes. Well, at the same time, they might be run by people who are in weird New Age religions like Mormonism. So if you're going to buy those things, it'd be nice to actually get them from somebody who shares the same values. In addition, we also have lanolin balm. If you know what that is, this is actually the oil taken from sheep's wool, and we've procured that as well. See, you got to do the autofocus here again. Boom. Isn't that magic? Look at that. There you go. I know here in Canada, in the winter, my hands get super dry and cracked just from the cold weather. I throw this on. It's a magic cure. Also, if you're somebody who works in the trades, you probably get calluses and things. And sure, it's nice to have rough hands. It shows you work hard, but at the same time, you don't want your hands bleeding all over the place. So check out the links in the description. Thank you for all your support. You're going to buy these products anyway. You may as well buy them from somebody who shares the same values. And last thing I'll say, I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying that frankincense oil has been proven in any, capacity that I can, put my reputation on. But it seems to me there's a lot of health benefits. And if you look those up, you can find those pretty easily as well. Some of them, they say, are even helping with anti-cancer properties. Again, make that decision for yourself.